Okay. There comes a time when even God gets to the end of his rope. You know, and the old saying, you know, if you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and then keep hanging on. Well, it's not like God has to hang on, but he does get to the end of his rope with man, and particularly with leaders of his people. Men have gone too far, and God will pass judgment when men go too far, even the people he calls his own. Beginning with Abraham, God wanted a people to lead the rest of the world to him. Now, God didn't set up a people, Israel, because they were better, because they were smarter, because they were prettier, because they were more handsome. He set up this nation because of his servant Abraham, who was maybe the only person on the entire earth at one time that was worshiping the one true God. His plan was never to only include Abraham's descendants in his kingdom. Never, ever was that part of it. But for a time, he worked with, pleaded with, and blessed this man's family, which we know and call Israel, until they finally disobeyed him to the point that he determined it was time to take action. And he took bloody action. The chapter 10, which we're not going into today, this chapter, along with a few others, show that it's time for God to put an end to a willfully disobedient people, beginning with the leaders. But there was a time when Israel had good leaders, particularly one, and you all know who that is, King David. And God made David a promise that one of his descendants would rule his people, always. And David was called a man after God's own heart. And David made sure that the people that he led worshiped the one true God, that they didn't worship all these Elohim, all of the false gods, and that Mark talked about a few weeks ago, a month ago, whatever. But things began to go downhill almost immediately after David died. But Solomon, David's son, was a pretty good leader. He wasn't, he made mistakes, but he was a pretty good leader. But he allowed his many wives to worship the gods of the lands that they were from. And of course, he would, every time they'd have an argument with another nation, Solomon would marry the daughter of the king. And so then instead of arguing and fighting with them, they're big buddies. But when Solomon died, the nation that God established to teach the world about him split. The kings of the south, which we know as Judah, did okay for a while. The leaders of the south did a fairly good job of keeping the people from worshiping the false gods. Not a good job, a fairly good job. But the northern tribes got off on the wrong foot almost immediately. I mean, it didn't take them 10 minutes, being a little facetious there, to start messing up. God even made it a point of appointing a man to lead the northern tribes who had an opportunity to become a great king, leading the people to worship him, the one true God. But it only took a short time that he, Jeroboam, went in the exact opposite direction. And there was even a saying about Jeroboam that we're all familiar with, and believe me, there's going to be some ad nauseum today in this scriptural study. But this was said about Jeroboam and about many of the northern kings and some of the southern kings that followed after him. It says, after this thing, Jeroboam did not return from his evil way, but made again of the lowest of the people. Now, this is talking about when he set up the golden calf in the north and the golden calf in the south. After this, he didn't stop. He made the lowest of the people priests of the high places. People, men that he could tell every move to make, and men who, by the way, had a couple of bucks and were able to pay tributes to Jeroboam. And so it says, whoever wanted to be a priest, Jeroboam consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. And here's the saying: this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, even to cut it off and to destroy it from off the face of the earth. But God was patient. He waited. He gave Jeroboam and his descendants, the kings, that his sons that followed him, gave them time to repent. So as you all know, this statement was said about 14 times, I believe, concerning kings of the northern tribes. And yes, I know that this is all redundant as we've seen the actions of these kings as we've been going through these studies of the non-writing prophets. And each of the kings who followed Jeroboam took God's people into more and more apostasy. I almost said apostrophe. Apostasy. So today what I want to do is go back and do another review, which we did just a few weeks ago, but this one hopefully is a little bit different. I want to review just the kings of Israel up to this point, because I'm not really going to be talking about the prophets today. And I want to do this before we get into chapter 10, because chapter 10 is kind of a culmination of all of the stuff that happens for 200 or 300 years before God gets to the end of his rope and says, okay, I'm done. Everybody out of the pool. Club is closing. So it's strange that the kingdom of Israel, God's people, became such a mess. And when we get into this chapter 10, we're going to see that it became a bloody mess. Not that there wasn't a bloody mess before, but it really got bloody in chapter 10. But we're going to see a king named Jehu go in and begin to just wipe out one of the dynasties of the northern tribes. Now, as we all know, the kings of the northern tribes did not follow the lineage of a single king like the kings of the south did. The kings of the south were all descendants of David, but the kings of the north were all over the place. And as we all know, King Jeroboam I was the first king of the northern tribes. Well, he reigned 24 years and, strangely enough, died of natural causes. He wasn't murdered. A lot of the ones that followed after him were, but his son and Jeroboam's entire family was wiped out, killed by Baasha. 1 Kings 15, beginning in verse 25. Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, okay, so while there was no dynasty of all the kings, you'd have a king and he'd have one or two sons that would follow him. So in the case of Jeroboam, Nadab followed him, and it talks about when he reigned based on the reigning king of Judah, to give us kind of an idea of when this was happening. But he only reigned for 2 years. And he did evil in the sight of Yahweh and walked in the way of his father Jeroboam, and in his sin. I mean, we're going to hear this ad nauseum. But Baasha, the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar, conspired against him. And Baasha killed him at Gibbethon, which, well, it doesn't matter where it was. He killed him. And he killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, to give us another timestamp. Baasha killed him and reigned in his stead. And it came to pass when he reigned, Baasha, that he killed all of the house of Jeroboam. Now I'm going to stop right here. All of us are familiar with hyperbole. And the writers of the Bible use hyperbole. And, I presume God inspired them to use hyperbole, because when we see the word all, it doesn't always mean 100%. But, I'll go through that a little bit later. But you all know that. It says he smote all the house of Jeroboam. He left not to Jeroboam any that breathed until he had destroyed him, according to the saying of Yahweh, which he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't kill 100% of them. I'm just saying that as we go through this, we're going to see some hyperbole. And why did he kill him? Because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned, and which he made Israel sin by his provocation wherewith he provoked Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, to anger. This Baasha, who wiped out the descendants of Jeroboam, reigned for 24 years and, strangely enough, died of natural causes. You would think that these kings that were so violent, this guy went out and killed no telling how many people, but he died of natural causes. So now we get another timestamp. In the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Asa began to reign over all of Israel, and he reigned for 24 years. And again, the same thing. He did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and he walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin. But his line is about to end. And that's, one of the points that I'm trying to make is in the northern tribes, it didn't work like it worked in the south. His line would end with his son Elah. It says, then the word of Yahweh came to Jehu the son. Now, this is not Jehu, the one that's going to kill all of the descendants of Omri. And I'm going to make a point of that. It's the descendants of Omri, not the descendants of Ahab, that Jehu the king kills. Yes, many of them were the descendants of Ahab, but God is having the line of Omri wiped out. We'll get into that a little bit later. Omri, as it turns out, and I'm off my notes at this point. If you read extra Bible history, it means outside the Bible, you will find that Omri was one of the greatest kings in the history of Israel. Now, I didn't say good king. I didn't say one of the best kings. I'm talking about greater as in he did more for Israel than any of the other kings. And you can read about that in other books. It doesn't say that much about him in the Bible. And so God tells Baasha, for as much as I exalted you out of the dust and made you prince over my people, but you've walked in the way of Jeroboam. You've done the same thing these guys that were before you, and you've made my people Israel to sin. You've let them worship other gods, and you've provoked me to anger. Behold, I'm going to take away all of the descendants of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, because God had allowed the house of Jeroboam to be completely wiped out. And then he goes on in verse 4, him that dies of Baasha in the city shall the dogs eat, him that dies in the fields. In other words, it doesn't matter where these descendants of Baasha are, they're going to die. And they're going to die violently. And in the 26th year, let me catch my notes here.
Hey, Skip.
Yeah, Jim.
It looks like in verse 1, If the word of the Lord came directly to Jehu, it doesn't mention any prophet, does it?
But Jehu is a prophet, and
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah, sorry.
I
He,
got mixed up.
yeah, no, there's another Jehu. Uh,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah, sort it out for me if you don't mind.
I hate to say it, but there's another Jehu. But this Jehu was a prophet. The Jehu that's going to come along to wipe out the descendants of Omri and Ahab is also a Jehu. He's ordained as the king, and this is many years before that happened. So this is a prophet. Um, so anyway, I don't know if that clears it up, but
Yeah, that helps. I just get mixed up when I get in Kings and stuff. And
you think you get mixed up. Oh my goodness. A couple of weeks ago, I was confused because we had kings of the north and kings of the south with the same names ruling at the same times, and then their sons were named the same names and so on. And today, when I get to the end of where we're going today, I was so confused. I had to call. I had to call a couple of people and say, "What on earth is happening here?" It is. It can get so confusing, and yet at the same time, it's fun, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this today. And I know it's ad nauseum. I know we've done it before, but instead of talking about the kings and adding in all the stuff about the prophets, we're just going to talk about the kings today.
Hey, Skip.
Yeah, Mark.
I missed something. Did you remind everybody about possibly using their timeline, maybe as you're going along here?
No, I did not. Thank you. Yeah, everybody grab your timeline because that'll help. The timeline that Mark uh, gave. And if you all need me to, I can put it up so you can take a picture of it or something. But yeah. And let's see. Since you mentioned that, I'll do the same, Mark, and see where we're landing here.
I mean, that one is one of the best ones I've ever seen. It just outlines where all the kings are mentioned. They're separate from the prophets, and you can see how they overlap, and you can see how the kings of the north and the kings from Judah overlap time-wise. Just has everybody named.
Yeah, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go grab that. Hang on just a second. This will be timeline, Mark. You'll love the way I title this, Mark's timeline. Because it is. Because I've got about 15 of them, but this one, well, it's not real big. Can everybody see it? Well, let me do this. I can do this. I can make it bigger. Oh, I thought I could. Okay. All right. Well, right here's where we are. Here's
You can
Jeroboam.
grab the little circle and draw it out on the corners.
Okay.
Draw
You know, that won't. Okay. I gotta move it. I gotta move it over a little bit.
out.
No, I can do it. Here's what I'm going to do. Okay, here. Size and position. All right, now let me make sure.
Would it be easier to just copy that image and dump it in your PowerPoint on its own page?
Michael, that's just too easy. Goodness.
Once it's on its own page, you can always zoom back out and then click on the page if you want to look at it. You could blow it up to fill the whole screen then you could stay in full screen mode.
Skip,
Yeah.
for folks that don't delete all of their messages, if you go back to July 31st at 4:12 p.m., Skip Martin sent us the timeline in an email.
Mm-hmm. Well, there you go. Okay, well, thanks to Mark and Michael, we now have the timeline that's big. Okay, so we've talked about Jeroboam the first. That was the Jeroboam that God said, I'm going to give you 10 of the tribes. Okay, and then we come along and we come up to Baasha. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to leave this up because I can read to you all, or you can turn to all of the scriptures. So thank you, Mark and Michael. I'm just going to leave this up. I don't need to go through the rest of it. Okay, so Nadab, the son of Jeroboam the first, reigned. Let me back up, because he only reigned a couple of years, right? Yeah, he reigned 2 years. Notice how small Mr. Nadab is right here. There's your 2 years. And the next king was Baasha, who historians say was the greatest, quote unquote. I'm sorry, Omri was the greatest. Never mind. This is Baasha, and Baasha wiped out the family of Jeroboam. I'll catch up with myself here in just a second. And he reigned for 24 years, and he died of natural causes. Okay, in the third year of Asa, king of Judah, began Baasha, the son of Ahijah, to reign over all Israel in Tirzah. And he reigned for 24 years. And guess what? He did evil in the sight of Yahweh, and he walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin. Now, you can see that his son Elah didn't reign but for a couple of minutes. You can see Elah's name is big enough to see, but his timeline is this little old bitty thing right here. It says, then the word of Yahweh came to Jehu, the son, and this is the prophet, the son of Hananiah, against Baasha, saying, for as much as I exalted you out of the dust. And this is something that I think we can think about. You know, God puts these people in their position and gives them every opportunity to be a good king.
Could you give us a scripture?
Yeah, that's 1 Kings 16, 1 through 4. Sorry. Thank you, Mark. I'm not used to that because I usually have all the scriptures, but I think it's a great idea to put this up today, to do it this way. So 1 Kings 16, 1 through 4. Somebody going to say something? Okay. He says, I exalted you, Baasha, and made you prince over my people in Israel. But guess what? You blew it. You walked in the way of Jeroboam and made my people Israel to sin. And you provoked me to anger with their sins. And he says in verse 3 here in 1 Kings 16, I will take away the posterity of Baasha. Okay, I'm going to wipe out your line and the posterity of his house, and I'll make your house just like I made Jeroboam. Wipe them out too. And then he goes on and says, him that dies of Baasha in the city shall, I read that a minute ago, and it doesn't matter where a descendant of Baasha is living, they're not going to make it. So next came Elah, Baasha's son. And you can see that he only reigned 2 years, that little bitty space, right? You can see Elah and then that little bitty space right there. And this might be a lesson to all of us. He got drunk and got killed by Zimri, along with all the other descendants of Baasha. And in 1 Kings 16:8, it says, in the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Elah, the son of Baasha, to rule over Israel in Tirzah 2 years. Now you can look down below and you can see that all during this time, that Baasha, Elah, Zimri, and Omri reigned. Asa, a good king, pretty good king, was reigning in Judah down below in green there. Okay. It says that Zimri, who is the next king there, and none of these guys are kin. I mean, it's just, I decide I want to be king, so I'm going to go out and kill Michael. Because Michael's not a very good king. I know I can be a better king than Michael. So Zimri kills Elah. It says, and he was just a captain of in the army. 1 Kings 16:9-13. It says, and his servant Zimri, captain of half of his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in his steward's house. And Zimri went in and he probably didn't have a lot of trouble with him because he probably staggering drunk. And he killed him. When did he kill him? In the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah. You can see there below on the timeline that Mark sent us. Asa is still ruling during all of this. And it says that Zimri reigned in his stead. Zimri didn't last but like a week. Said it came to pass when he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, this is Zimri, that he slew all the house of Baasha. He left him not one male, neither of his kinfolks, nor of his friends. I mean, he took care of all of them.
That was common to kill your brothers so they wouldn't compete with you.
Yeah. Yes, it will, and friends. You don't want anybody that liked the guy to stir up any rabble so they might come and attack you. Thanks, Rob. Verse 12 says, thus did Zimri destroy all the house of Baasha, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. And Zimri only ruled for 7 days. Well, I mean, he didn't last long at all. And then there was a big fight between Tibni and Omri over who's going to reign next. You can see both of their names in there, right under Zimri. And in 1 Kings 16, beginning in verse 15, it says, in the 27th year of Asa, see, Asa's still ruling down here, did Zimri reign 7 days, and the people were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. I don't know why they added that, but I could have put a map in here, but that's okay. And the people that were encamped heard say, Zimri has conspired and has slain the king. Okay, so, the army's out there and they hear that Zimri's killed the king. And that the rest of the Israelites have made Omri, who was just a captain, king over Israel that day in the camp. And Omri went up from Gibbethon and all Israel with him, and they besieged Tirzah. And so they're going up to get rid of Zimri. It came to pass, when Zimri saw the city was taken, he committed suicide. He went into the palace of the king's house and burnt the king's house down around his own head and died. And then the same statement is made about him that was made about Jeroboam and was made about Nadab and made about Baasha. He did evil in the sight of Yahweh in walking in the way of Jeroboam and in his sin, which he did to make Israel sin. Okay, now this set up the house of Omri. And I hate to use the word greatest, but Omri was the great, even though he didn't reign as long as some of the rest of these guys, he did more to make the northern tribes a world-known power than anybody else in the line of all the different families that that ruled. There were several kings in Israel who had descendants who sat on the throne, but none of them were like the house of Omri. And strangely enough, as wicked as Omri was, he died of natural causes. I may have said that a while ago. But he had some kids. He had 3 sons and a queen. We'll talk about the queen later. But he had 3 sons that ruled: Ahab, Ahaziah. Well, let me back up. Ahab was a son, Ahaziah was a grandson, and Joram or Jehoram was his great grandson. And they all reigned. So Omri, out of all of the kings of the north, is the only one that really had a dynasty. And part of his dynasty was even in the south. His granddaughter, Athaliah, who married king of Judah, Joram or Jehoram. Here we go with the same names. And when he died, she reigned in his place. And I'm going to cover that a little bit later. So 1 Kings 16:23. We're still in the time of the reign of Asa. It says, in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri began to reign over Israel. And he reigned for 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tirzah. Now, the reason for the split there is that part of Israel did not recognize him as the king. Part of them recognized Tibni as the king. And then it says that he in verse 24 of 1 Kings 16, says he bought the hill of Samaria for 2 talents of silver, and that's where he built he built the summer palace there that Ahab stayed in. And in some places it's called the winter palace. So it's the summer and winter palace. And it must have been a nice place because the kings sure did like to stay there. But verse 25, but Omri wrought evil in the eyes of Yahweh, and boy, this is not something you want to be told about you, did worse than all that were before him. And he's not the last one we're going to hear that phrase about. For he walked in the way of Jeroboam, here we go, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin, and he provoked the Yahweh Elohim of Israel to anger with their vanities. In verse 28 of 1 Kings 16, it says, so Omri slept with his fathers. He died of natural causes. I'm sorry, folks, that just blows me away. It really does. As bad as this guy was, the worse than Zimri, Elah, Baasha, and Jeroboam, Omri died of natural causes. I just think that is so humorous. And guess what? The most famous king of all of the northern tribes, his son Ahab, began to reign. And you'll notice again, Ahab begins to reign in part of Asa's rule, but most of his is while Jehoshaphat was the king of Judah. In 1 Kings 16:28, it says, so Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his stead. Remember, Samaria was both a city and a country. City-wise, it was the capital of Samaria, where the northern tribes, it was kind of their headquarters. So Omri's son Ahab ruled after Omri died. And again, the comment was made that he was more wicked than all that were before him. And the writer adds something here that he didn't say about anybody else. Talks about his wife, and we know who that is. 1 Kings 16:29 says, in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, okay, so Asa is still reigning when Ahab takes over, began Ahab, the son of Omri, to reign over Israel. And Ahab, the son of Omri, reigned for 22 years. You can see there a fairly long reign looking at the chart that Mark sent us. And it said, Ahab, shock, the son of Omri did evil in the sight of Yahweh above all that were before him. You know, it's not the first time we've heard that. In other words, they're getting worse and worse. But what he did that really got Yahweh, I mean, it really, really, really burned up God. It says in verse 31 of chapter 16, and it came to pass as if it had been no big deal to walk in the sins of Jeroboam and to be worse than all of the kings before him, as if that were no big deal. He took Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. He's the one that brought Baal worship into the northern tribes via his wife, who was the worst of all women probably that ever lived. Scriptures don't say that. I'm saying that. And it says that he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. So right there in the middle of the capital, he builds not only an altar, but he built a temple. Now, how would you like for this to be said about you? And Ahab made a grove, and he did more. This is in verse 33. He did more to provoke Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. And that's not the first time that it was said, but it's now being said about Ahab. He's worse than all of the ones that came before him. Okay, so next we come to Ahab's son Ahaziah, and if you notice, it's not very long, right here, and it's still during the reign of Jehoshaphat in the south. He only reigned 2 years because, if you remember, he was injured in a fall, and he died shortly after. And there's this long story about him asking his wife to get the prophet to go down and ask. Anyway, I'm not going into that. We went into that a few weeks later. In 1 Kings 22:40, it says Ahab slept with his fathers, and Ahaziah, his son, reigned in his stead. Okay, and we can see that on the timeline. And Mark, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you mentioning this, because this has got to be making it more clear for you all. Instead of just names, you can look at this thing. And I hope that's right, but it seems to me that it's a lot more clear. And Michael, thank you for having me make it full screen. Okay. 2 Kings chapter 1, beginning in verse 2. Ahaziah, okay, the son of Ahab, fell, and he didn't reign very long. You can see there in the timeline. He fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria, okay, and was sick. Well, yeah, it broke a bunch of bones. Y'all have heard me say before that I fell off a ladder and it just from like 4 feet in the air and broke my heel into about a couple of hundred pieces. Now, fortunately for me, it was an eggshell break. All the pieces stayed together, but it's still in a couple hundred pieces. But anyway, Ahaziah wasn't so fortunate. He broke a whole bunch of bones. There's no telling what he did to his internal organs. And in so he only reigned for a couple of years. It says so in verse 17, so he died according to the word of Yahweh, which Elijah had spoken of. Elijah said this was going to happen. And Jehoram, or Joram, it's funny. Here we are. The scripture says Jehoram, and the timeline says Joram. And they're both correct. Jehoram reigned in his stead in the 2nd year of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. Here we go. You got, look above, it says Joram, or it could say Jehoram, reigned at the same time that Jehoram, or it could say Joram, reigned in the south. I don't know if it confused the Israelites and the people from Judah, but it certainly confuses Skip. But this Joram in the south is the son of Jehoshaphat, and we're still going down the dynasty of David in the south, and in the north we're all over the place. Nobody. Although we're still in the dynasty of Omri. But Omri's the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, 5.5 kings later. We've got Ahab. And here we are in Ahaziah, which is 6.5. I say a half because of Tibni and Omri. Okay. So Omri's last descendant to reign in Israel was Joram. By this time, God has gotten past the end of his rope. He was totally fed up with this family. And he pronounced an end to it in 1 Kings chapter 21, beginning in verse 21. I'll give you a minute to turn to it. He says, "Behold, I will bring evil on you." On who? On Joram. "And I'll take away your posterity." Your kids aren't going to reign, Jack. It's over. We're ending it with you. "And I'll cut off from Ahab." Now he's when he's talking to Joram, he's talking about Ahaziah's children, if he has any. He's talking about Ahab's children, if he has any. And he's talking about Omri's children that weren't Ahab's and weren't Ahaziah's and weren't Joram's. Okay? So he's talking about this whole dynasty and all of the males that were descendants of Omri. And he says, "I'll make your house like the house of Jeroboam." Here we go again. Go all the way back to the first one that God said, "Jeroboam, I'm done with you. I'm wiping out your descendants, and you're not going to have any kids reigning over my people in Israel." But he says, "I'll make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and like the son of Baasha, the son of Ahijah. Why? For the provocation wherewith you have provoked me to anger." That's another phrase you don't want God to be saying about you. That you provoked God to anger. Wow. "And made Israel to sin," taking us back to Jeroboam. Now, I'm going to use the word that I use too much. Interestingly, though, it seems that God allowed one of Ahab's descendants to survive. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this today. And we'll talk about that, a little bit more in a minute, because when God says all, there's a little hyperbole that's in it. Just like when you or I say all, man, everybody was at the party the other night. Oh, really? Everybody, Skip? Huh. There's 60,000 people in Jonesboro, and you're saying everybody was at the party. Well, no, I'm just talking, hyperbole. Okay. So just remember that God allows one of Ahab's descendants to survive, even though he says that he's taking Ahab's descendants out. Okay? Now, in 2 Kings chapter 3, we're at Joram or Jehoram there, under Ahaziah in the north. Now, Joram, the son of Ahab, okay? Now, he's actually the the great, I think he's the grandson, but we won't get into that. Began to reign over Israel in Samaria the 18th year of Jehoshaphat. See, go straight down. And Jehoshaphat is still reigning in the south. And Joram reigned for 12 years. And he wrought evil in the sight of Yahweh. But there was a little bit of a difference here. Not a lot, but a little bit. Enough that God takes note of it. But not like his father and like his mother, for he put away the image of Baal that his father had made. Nevertheless, he cleaved to the sins of Jeroboam. In other words, he did this. He took down the altar. He took down the temple to Baal. But he still allowed the people of Israel to worship their own pagan gods. That's what he means when he says, nevertheless.
Skip, is this the golden calf worship still?
I think
Yeah.
so.
Wasn't that the original one?
I don't think
Yeah.
it's the original. Wait, did somebody say yeah?
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I was just doing something for sermon I have to give next Sabbath, which is the one I gave here a week or so ago, modifying it for them. The deep state of evil. Looking at images having to do with Jezebel and Ahab, and they tie it back to even to the Hebrews when they're coming out of Egypt. It's one of those bulls. It's one of those cow golden cows. That's the image that I keep seeing even in carvings from that era. Is it's a cow, it's a cat, with the big horns and whatnot.
Yes, but Jim, was your question is it the exact same cow, or are you just saying it was like that?
Well, no, I'm saying is are they still worshiping?
Absolutely.
I mean, the sins of him were the original sin, if I remember, was that he makes these two golden calves, one in the north, one in the south, and they were worshiping golden calves. I don't know the literally same one, but if you put away Baal and you're still following the sins of Jeroboam, it sounds like you're worshiping the calves again.
Yeah,
And probably they have been all along.
Yeah, just like what Michael just said. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
It looks like that. It looks like that giant cow that's in front of the stock exchange. I'm not kidding. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, that makes
it's tied to wealth and money, actually. And when you look at God's indictment that he finally hands down with Amos, one of the indictments that God gives to, we'll cover this as we get into it in the future, is that the big indictment is you're just as evil and wicked as the nations. The only difference is you do it to your own people and you do it for money. So that might have ties to the Baal worship. Again, speculation on my part, but I find it fascinating. Satan sticks to what works, and we see those things trickling down in our era too. So, just my thoughts.
Yep. Okay. Interesting. Okay, so now we have Joram or Jehoram reigning in the north, and we have Joram reigning in the south. Gets nice and confusing. Now we covered some of this last week or last time I spoke. I don't even remember the last time, but anyway, we covered the final days of Joram, and he was struck in the heart by an arrow shot by Jehu's bow. Now, see, God has gotten Jehu to be anointed king by a servant of Elisha, and he's the king, and the people accepted him as the king because the army accepted him as the king, which is really kind of interesting because this went on many, many, many times whoever the army said was king was going to be king, because if you didn't agree with it, you're in big trouble. So in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 24, now we're at Jehu. Now in the south, we've got Joram's son Ahaziah, and then I'll talk about Athaliah later. She is the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And look at that name and look where she reigned. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. So Jehu,
Skip.
yes, Barb.
In the southern part there, in Jehoram, there's a line. It looks like a step ladder almost, or a step. What is the reason for that? Do you know?
Yeah, both Jehoshaphat and Jehoram were
Yes.
considered kings at the same time for a little.
Oh, I see.
If I'm not mistaken, I haven't gone back and read it, but it seems to me like Jehoram was an assistant or something of Jehoshaphat. Does anybody remember that? We covered that a few weeks ago, or could be months.
Was it because the Jehoshaphat was sick and Jehoram was assuming the duties?
I think that's right. Yeah.
And that may have been also the case with Asa. You groom your replacement, so they kind of co-rule at that point until the king passes on. That makes sense.
It does. Yeah, thanks. And that's exactly what was happening. I didn't go back and look up all that stuff. We covered it before, but then, hey, Skip, we covered all this stuff you're talking about today before. But this is more fun, especially with this chart. This chart really made my job a lot easier today. So again, thank you guys. Okay, so 2 Kings 9, verse 24, it says, Jehu drew a bow with his full strength and smote Jehoram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart. It went all the way through him, apparently. It came out his heart, and he died almost immediately, or died immediately. So then we get Ahaziah. Yeah, Jehu's not king. Well, he kind of is king, but he's we're back a little bit before that. He's after he's been anointed king, but he isn't reigning at this point. But Ahaziah, king of Judah, was also killed by Jehu. If you remember, Ahaziah had gone down to visit okay, see the two Ahaziahs there? When Ahaziah, the king of Judah, okay, so go down to the green, you've got that. He's gone up to visit Joram. And it says that Jehu followed after him and said, smite him also in the chariot, and so on. So Jehu killed not only the king of the north, but he also killed the king of the south, which really caused a problem for the people in the south. The people in the north were used to kings changing all the time, but something's about to happen in the south that had never happened before. Now, this is the beginning of the end of the dynasty of Omri in the northern tribes. The wording is all about Ahab, but it was Omri's dynasty that ended in chapter 10, which we'll cover next time. Ahab reigned over Israel for 22 years, and he was shot with an arrow at the battle of Ramoth Gilead, and he died, earlier. And we read of a surprising number of Ahab's descendants beginning in 2 Kings 10, which I'm not going through today, but in 2 Kings 10:1, it says, now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. 70. He must have had more than one wife or concubine. And so,
I was about to say, I don't think Jezebel was I don't know of any female that could produce that many kids.
No, that'd be pretty rough. It says Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria to the rulers of Jezreel. Well, in other words, Jehu said, "Hey, get all of these descendants of Ahab up here. I need to talk to them. I'm going to give them a prize or whatever." We'll get into that next time. So these were all killed by Jehu, who had been anointed king, in order to end the line of Omri. And remember, it's Omri's line that's ending, which includes Ahab's line and Ahaziah's line and Joram's line. But there were many, many more descendants of Omri besides Ahab's, which we will see next week or whenever we get back to chapter 10. Now, one of these descendants, and you can see her name in the South. We're now going to talk about the South. You know, through this whole Bible study, 23 weeks worth, 22 weeks worth, we hadn't talked about the kings in the South very much at all. It's all about the kings of the North, because they're the ones that were, how do I say this? They're the ones that really irritated God more so than the kings of the South. Hence, the kings of the North, or the people of the North, got taken into captivity a couple of hundred years, if I'm not mistaken, before the people of Judah. I'm pretty sure that's right. Okay, so one of these other descendants of Omri was Ahab's daughter Athaliah, who actually ruled Judah for 7 years. And you can see that right here, right after Ahaziah. Ahaziah was her son. Okay? And she ruled after he was killed. You can see he didn't rule long. She ruled Judah for 7 years. Now, why why they put up with her, only God knows. She was as wicked as her mother Jezebel. And she tried to wipe out the entire line of David, but was thwarted when Joash was hidden, who was her grandson. She was going to kill her grandson. Of course, she killed all her brothers earlier. Now, this is from an article that I found in the New World Encyclopedia that a little bit interesting. In her youth, Athaliah had been married to Jehoram to seal a treaty between the two sometimes warring nations of Judah and Israel. After Jehoram's death, now that's after Jehoram in the south, after his death, their son Ahaziah became Judah's king. And you can see there that he didn't reign very long at all. However, during a state visit to Israel, Ahaziah was murdered by Jehu, along with Athaliah's mother, Jezebel. Remember, he was up in the north. Shouldn't have been up there, but he was. So her brother, King Joram of Israel, and many other royal family members were killed also. And that's what we'll talk about next time. Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, countered this by staging a bloody coup in Jerusalem. So we've got descendants of Omri being murdered in the north, and we've got descendants of David being murdered in the south, so she could place herself on the throne, and she attempted to eliminate any possible royal heir, any possible heir of David. She reigned for 6 to 7 years, and she continued her husband's policy of allowing the worship of both Baal and Yahweh. Now, this is the first time I've heard that, but we should know that in both the north and the south, there were worshipers of the one true God. Not very many in the north, but there were some, and they worshipped Baal, And the same thing happened in the south. But the young boy Joash was hidden from her, a descendant of David. Also a descendant of Omri. So one of Omri's descendants lived. Here's the hyperbole. When it says all, it means all, but it means almost all. But anyway, so when the time was ripe, Jehoiada overthrew and executed Athaliah and placed Joash on the throne in her place. And you can see there, right after Athaliah in the south, you can see that Joash ruled. And he was a descendant of David. But he was also kin to Omri. Okay.
I would thought.
Yeah.
As you're going through this, I'm looking. It makes you wonder if George R.R. Martin can be sued for plagiarism. Because if this isn't Game of Thrones, I don't know what is.
Yeah. Good point. Yep. Yep. And we've had some Lord of the Rings, and we've had some Star
Right.
Wars, and yeah. Okay. Note that Joash was Athaliah's grandson. And that means, and I know I've said this, that at least one of Omri's descendants survived. It's not a contradiction. It's hyperbole. The writers of the Bible often used hyperbole in their writings. All doesn't always mean all. It means most or just about everyone. When God says all Israel shall be saved, does that mean that not one single Israelite will be lost? I think not. Even God uses hyperbole sometimes. In 2 Kings chapter 11, and this is a little bit more about Athaliah, says, when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal seed, except one. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, Athaliah's son, so that would be Athaliah's niece? Anyway, it doesn't matter. She took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons, among David's descendants, which were slain, and they hid him, even him and his nurse, in the bedchamber from Athaliah, so that he was not slain. In verse 3, he was hid in her house of Yahweh for 6 years, and Athaliah did reign over the land. This just blows me away. That this woman created a coup, and she reigned over Judah. Just crazy. Okay, now this is all happening during Jehu's reign in the north, and Jehu was anointed by, first Elijah was told to anoint him, and Elijah deferred to Elisha, and then Elisha deferred to one of the sons of the prophets to anoint Jehu. And if you remember, we just talked about this the other day, Jehu was taken into a side chamber by this son of the prophets and was anointed king, and then the son of the prophet took off because he knew there's bad stuff about to happen. So Jehu comes back in, and now he's a commander in the army. He comes back in, and his buddies say, well, what was that all about? What were you doing talking to that crazy guy? And Jehu said, it's no big deal. You know the guy's crazy. And they said, no. Something happened. Tell us what happened. And so he said, well, okay, I was anointed king. And they were going, long live the king is dead, long live the king. And the army supported Jehu. So no other king or descendant of Omri or anybody had a chance because the army was behind Jehu. All right. Now, Second Chronicles says a little bit about this. Chapter 23 in Second Chronicles, beginning in verse 12. It says, "Now when Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king," she's like, "What?" "She came to the people into the house of Yahweh, and she looked, and the king stood at his pillar at the entering in." Now we're talking about Joash. Well, are we talking about Joash here? Wait. I don't remember the context here. I don't know which one. "And she looked, and behold, the king stood at his pillar at the entering in, and the princes and the trumpets by the king. And all the people of the land rejoiced and sounded with trumpets." And this has to be Joash, and he was just a young boy. "But the singers and the instruments of music and as such taught to sing praise. Then Athaliah rent her clothes and said, 'Treason, treason!' But they didn't listen to her. Then Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of the hundreds that were set over the host and said, 'Have her forth of the ranges, and whoso follows her, let him be slain. We're not following this evil woman anymore. Let him be slain by the sword.' For the priest said, 'Slay her, but not in the temple, not in the house of the Lord.' So they laid hands on her, they took her outside, and they killed her. And they were done with Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel." Now, that's the end of what I've got, but there was one thing that was kind of interesting to me. I know I use that word too much. I went and looked at the genealogies of Jesus Christ this morning, and most of it, you kind of go to sleep when you're reading that stuff. But there's a point in there where some of these kings are mentioned. And for the first time, I'm like, okay, I know those guys. I've read about those guys. I've studied about those guys. There's not very many of them. There's 2 or 3 of them in there that are the guys that we've been talking about for weeks. So, I mean, it meant a little bit more to me than it had in the past. So that's it for today. I know it was redundant, but thank you, Mark. And then thank you, Michael, for having me expand it, because I hope you all got as much out of this timetable as I did, because it made it work much, much better. So thoughts, comments?
What I find really interesting, Skip, as we're going through this, is when Paul talks about leavening and how little leaven leavens the whole lump, and you look at, we had the split, which was God ordained because of the sin of I guess for Solomon, for lack of a better identifier, for all of his hundreds of wives, and allowing them to worship their pagan gods, and David would never allow that. And so the split, you have that split, and so you have the southern tribe of David, and then Jeroboam's lying on top. What's interesting is the leavening of Jezebel and Ahab, or Omri, if you want to go back that far. The leavening ends up getting seated into the throne of Judah and Benjamin through that marriage that was done with, was it Ahaziah?
It would have been Jehoram and Athaliah, I think. Ahaziah was the son.
Oh, that's right. Okay, Jehoram and Athaliah marry. I mean, the fact that little leaven leavens the whole lump, and that marriage of convenience to solidify treaties, which, by the way, that's how it was done. And marriages were kind of like signing a treaty, as it were, in the old world. And so it was all done for power's sake. It wasn't, out of reverence for following the laws of God or the principles of God. Once people decided that they wanted a king, everything revolves around achieving and maintaining power and control, which again gets to the whole idea of the whole deep state thing, and that's where this is. And so you're seeing all the treachery that happens as a result. I just look at the chart, and you could look at it and see, well, the seed of leavening, that first of all, that leavening is going to destroy the northern 10 tribes in total, by 709. And but the same leavening has been growing within Judah at that point until 586, when they get to go into their captivity. So I just find that interesting, as you would say, in terms of recognizing that sin of Jeroboam ends up getting put into the southern kingdom, which again it also all stems back to Solomon in a way, if you want to consider it.
Yeah, and it goes back to something that you talked about a couple of weeks ago. All of these people were advising the king that followed them, or that was. I mean, you had the deep state, as you made a great Bible study sermon on, and all these guys are advising. You got the worst that's advising somebody that has a chance, but because of the advice they followed, that it didn't work.
Yeah, God or Scripture records them as counselors in wickedness.
Yeah,
and they remain. Kings come and go, but these people somehow manage to stay into the bureaucracy, as it were.
That is correct. All right. Any other comments? I hope, and I don't think it was, thanks to the chart, but I hope this wasn't too much ad nauseum and redundancy, because I know we've talked about all these guys, but I don't know. I just wanted to do something a little bit different, and I thought maybe a little easier on me, but it didn't turn out that way. But I really enjoyed going through this today. And we're going to have a test. I'm going to take away the chart. And are you all ready for the test?
No, Eric is laughing upstairs. Barb, you had a comment?
Yes. Yeah, I would glad to go over this again because, well, like you said, it's a confusing thing, and to go over it again in detail, it really did help me get it all kind of straightened out in my mind. So I appreciate that.
Good. It's the chart did more for me than my notes, because what I have in my notes are a whole bunch of scriptures, but this chart really, Mark, you're my hero. Well, you're one of my heroes. You're not my hero. Okay. Anybody else? So this was kind of an introduction to chapter 10 that we're going to go over next time, where we're going to see Jehu get to work. And
Gene, you have a comment?
Yeah, just kind of an off-the-wall thing. Michael, you mentioned Game of Thrones. I've actually noticed a lot of, at the very least, hints towards biblical stories within fantasy novels and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's funny that people in our church culture kind of, well, why would you even watch shows like that? And granted, there's always, we live in this world, and people are drawing from things that are not of God. But from an historical perspective, again, when he's going through this, and you look at this chart, and you're like, okay, so the guy that wrote Game of Thrones totally ripped off the scriptures, because it's what it looks like, and all the subterfuge and the deep state and the slaying of these people, and then the evil kings coming up. If you never, Game of Thrones is raunchy, but the politics of it is very reminiscent to this chart that we're staring at.
Yeah, I did I did have a problem getting into Game of Thrones because of the raunchiness, and I started to read the books first, and I couldn't get past the brother-sister thing, and so I stopped reading it, and then I had the same problem with the TV show.
Yeah, but the politics of it and all the subterfuges, everybody is clamoring for power. And I find that, again, it looks like this chart. If you wanted to do Game of Thrones and all the people vying for the throne, it looks like this chart.
Yeah, I have heard otherwise. It's a pretty good show.
Yeah, there's so much filtering that we have to do, and we have several chats. Prasad came in. Welcome, Prasad. And John and Prasad talked a little bit there. Let's go ahead and have a.
Speaking of Prasad, he made a private request to me, and I told him he'd have to request it from you, but he'd like a copy of the songs that you played. I don't know if you have MP3s of those or something you could email him.
I probably do have MP3. I mean, I know I have MP3s. They could be waves. I'm not going to send him a wave. It'd take him a month to download that. But
or a link to the YouTube file so he can pull it off his new laptop that we got him.
Well, now he could go. Okay, actually, I'm going to stop recording here.